So welcome everybody to this evening's event on drawing Syria from afar. My name's Catherine Harlow and I'm the director of the Institute of Classical Studies. And this Zoom background into which I keep vanishing is my attempt to give you an idea of what Diana Pfeffer-Bridge's artwork, The Destruction of Palmyra, looks like in situation in the Institute of Classical Studies library. And her drawing was the starting point for this evening's event. I'm very grateful to Bill Sherman from the Warburg Institute and to our various speakers, about whom you'll hear more in a minute, and many others for bringing this event together. It's been some time in the coming. The prompt for the event was when Bill asked me maybe 9-10 months ago whether the Institute of Classical Studies would be willing to house Diana's drawing temporarily for a couple of years while the Warburg is undergoing refurbishment. An anonymous donor had kindly offered given the drawing as a gift to the Warburg, but the Warburg had nowhere to hang it. And I was absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to bring it to the Institute of Classical Studies and to hang it in our combined library for a number of reasons. So I'll just say a bit about that. One is because, of course, Syria, and specifically Roman Syria, but not just Roman Syria, very much comes within the purview of the Institute of Classical Studies. Classics is a name which has a lot of debate behind it, a lot of history behind it. But really, we are about the study of the ancient Mediterranean world, including all sides of the Mediterranean, the east as well as the north and the west. Syria, of course, has a very, very long history. Tadmor itself turns up in texts as early as 2000 BC, and I believe the archaeology dates back to about 5,000 years before that. It was a province of the Roman Empire, but of course was very well known as a centre of culture, of literature, and of material culture long before that. Another reason why the Institute of Classical Studies has a particular interest in Syria and in the site of Tadmor Palmyra is to do with our special collections. We hold in the Institute the manuscripts of Robert Wood, who was an Irish traveller who visited the site in the mid-18th century and indeed was immortalised in a painting by Gavin Hamilton called Wood, I think, Discovering the Ruins of Palmyra. Now, discovery is obviously a very interesting and misleading word in the context of a city and a site that has the history I've just outlined. And I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about that from one of our speakers this evening. But when I read Diana's website and read her reflections on her art, it was also very clear to me that there was a consonance in outlook between the work that she was producing and the way she was thinking about these themes, and some of the work which has been carried on by researchers in London who have indeed published some of that work under the aegis of the Institute of Classical Studies. And I've thought in particular of a bulletin of the Institute of Classical Studies issue that was published in 2019, edited by Baird and Zena called Remembering Roman Syria, Valuing Tadmor Palmyra from its discovery to destruction. And so from that kind of consonance in outlook, there also began the idea for this event, the idea of bringing a group of people together who could comment, who could respond to Diana's artwork, but who would also think about Syria, think about Tadmor Palmyra in the past and also in the present as well. And so I'm very pleased that we have finally managed to bring this event together and make it into an open event, a public event that anyone could sign up to. I will hand over in a minute to Professor Bill Sherman, the director of the Warburg Institute, who will chair our discussion. But I just wanted to make a few technical announcements before I do that. The first is that this event is being recorded, and the recording will be published afterwards on the Institute of Classical Studies and the Warburg websites. However, we're only going to publish the bit where members of the panel are giving some reflections at the start and the initial discussion between them and Bill. We don't intend to publish questions from the audience. So when it comes to asking questions, and please feel free to type them in the chat, please feel free to ask those questions, knowing that we are not intending to publish your questions. There is also an option to listen to this event both live and later in the recording in Arabic. If you would prefer to listen in Arabic, we have simultaneous interpretation operating tonight. If you'd like to access that, you need to look at the bottom of your screen where there should be an earth symbol. And if you click on the earth symbol, I'm hesitating slightly because I cannot see it on my screen. It should give you a choice of languages. And you can click onto the Arabic channel and listen to the simultaneous interpretation. I hope that is working, but someone please let us know if it's not working. Other than that, I think this is the point at which I can hand over to Bill before I vanish entirely into my fake Zoom background. But I very much hope that you all enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. First, for hosting us tonight at the Institute of Classical Studies, and also, of course, for hosting Deanna's fantastic work in what I am ashamed to say is the perfect setting for it. So it's just wonderful to have it there in the Institute of Classical Studies. And we'll say at the end later that everyone is welcome to come and see the work in situ in the reading room in the Institute of Classical Studies. And then in about 1 year and 3 months, it will be in the reading room at the Warburg Institute, about 5 minutes walk away. So we're very, very happy to have the work. And I just want to say very, very briefly and quickly what I'm sure everybody here will echo, which is just want to thank Deanna for making the work, as well as for allowing it to be presented to us for perpetuity. I've known Deanna's work for a long time, but especially as a scholar of drawing and as a curator. But her extraordinary practice continues on the biggest of scales and at the most intense spectrum here of engagement, and I'm just thrilled to have her present, Deanna, and have the work finally being discussed by those who are really well placed to comment on it. So really happy about this event. And I'm also happy that Deanna continues as an associate fellow at the Warburg Institute. So that's great. Very, very pleased about that. Now we have 4 speakers. Ammar Azzouz is first, and he will speak in more detail than the others. We will then have 3 quite short comments, and then we'll have a bit of discussion ourselves before opening it up to the floor. And I'll just say a very quick couple sentences about each speaker before they speak. So I'll start with Ammar Azzouz, and he's born and raised in Homs, Syria, but currently based in the UK, where he has worked as both an architect and an academic. He is currently a lecturer in heritage studies at the University of Essex and a research associate at Oxford. And I'm sure he'll tell us about it, but he has a fantastic book coming out next year with Bloomsbury called Architecture, War, and the Destruction of Home in Syria. And so, Ammar, without further ado, I hand over to you. And you should be able to share your screen and take over.
Wonderful. So I'm going to rely on Catherine to share the slides. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you so much for the organizers for bringing us together and for giving me the chance to contribute to this wonderful conversation. I'm from Homs, as Bill mentioned, and I left the country 11 years ago. I never been able to return, and I'll be talking a little bit in the next 10-15 minutes on what's the relationship between the everyday and the war, and what I saw in that interlink between the everyday and war in Diana's work. So Syria has turned into one of these forgotten wars. After 11 years of destruction, we rarely hear today about a country where over 14 million people have been displaced from their homes. Whilst millions of people have crossed the borders of their home country into countries as Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Germany, and more, over 6.5 million people have been internally displaced people. They are often less heard of, these people who are internally displaced. There have been cases where people have been displaced as many as 25 times inside Syria. I am one of these 14 million and more people who are displaced from their homes. I left in 2011 and I have never been able to return to my city, Homs, which is the third largest city in Syria. In my city, the third city after Damascus and Aleppo, over half of the neighborhoods have been heavily destroyed. And what we have witnessed for over a decade now is that destruction was not only deliberately erasing the built environment of cultural heritage sites such as Palmyra, which is in the Homs government, so it's 2 hours away from my city's center, but we also see the deliberate destruction of everyday spaces. Next slide, please. It is the destruction of the bakery shop and the targeting of the people waiting for hours for their daily bread. It's the willful destruction of people's homes and the erasure of the places, and also burning their property owner documents. So it's not only destroying people's homes, but also their presence, their ownership, their documents that prove as evidence to their belongings. It is domicide that is the willful destruction of a place that people call home. Next slide, please. It is the war on everyday. So this is like the work I reference on domicide, which is the deliberate destruction of home or the killing of the home, which I reference here, the authors that I borrowed the term from them. I always ask in my work and in my research if war ever leaves people after it enters their life. Next slide. The everyday therefore becomes the battlefield. The everyday is the war zone, even when troops and bulldozers are away, even when soldiers and armies are no longer marching across streets to arrest, to kill, to displace civilians. The everyday is the battlefield. People carry on with their life between ruins, waiting for a change. Next slide. This interlink between the everyday and the war is what brings me so close to the work of Diana Bitherbridge. Through scenes of abandoned buildings, empty kitchens, ruined living rooms, and decaying bedrooms, Diana's work on Homs has created a masterpiece that witnesses a history of suffering to a city that once was known as the capital of the revolution, Homs. Next slide. I first saw Diana's work on Homs at Tate Britain in summer 2019. I kept staring at it, at the drawing before reading its title because it felt so familiar. Of course, it brought to my mind other ruined cities, such as in countries as Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. But for some reason, seeing it from far away in the exhibition hall, I thought this is Homs. Even though the drawing did not have a direct representation to any of Homs's landmark or monument, these falling buildings made me only think of my city and not of any other war-torn cities. So I get back home searching for the artist who drew Homs from Afar, Diana Bitherbridge, and I sent her an email. Next slide. Dear Diana, I said, just wanted to say thanks a lot for the work you did on Homs, my city in Syria. I have seen the piece at Tate recently and found it extremely powerful and sad. It is a great contribution to the history of war in Syria, and it tells the story of violence, displacement, and war of our times. The creatureless drawing seems, with the absence of lives and people in it, as a true reflection to many areas in Syria where people were killed or forcibly displaced from a place they call home. I hope our paths cross at some point. I'm a great fan of your work. Best regards, Ammar. I actually thought I would never get a response, but I got a response. And our friendship and mutual admiration continues until today. Next slide. Diana's drawing of Homs has lived in my mind and heart since I saw it at Tate Britain. For my forthcoming book on Domicide for Bloomsbury, I asked Diana if I can have her drawing as the cover of my book. She kindly agreed. Diana's drawing of Homs is a powerful representation of the horrors of war. It's a witness to the horrors of war. It is a homage also to the people whose lives have been reshaped by violence. While we hear often about political powers during wars, we rarely hear about the effect of these wars on people's homes and their everyday life. This is why Diana's work felt like a shift in what observers see at the time of war, namely the everyday life, including people's homes. It's a symbolic work that Diana told me that she demanded to draw every inch of it and the surface with immense attention to detail. She also told me once for a paper I was working about the work that by doing so, by putting all the details, I quote here, I could commemorate all the imaginary people and their activities, the office buildings, the factories, the mosques, the schools and hospitals and the homes, apartments and workshops and their bombardment to rubble and dust. End of quote. So what I really found like important and significant in this specific drawing was how we are very close to the everyday life, to the spaces of everydayness, rather than looking at political powers that we see in the news. Next slide. For me, this drawing is a documentation of a history of suffering and creates a drawing in a homage to Homs, in a homage to Syria. It's a history of people who have endured loss since the start of the Syrian revolution in 2011. It's a loss of home, a loss of people, and a loss of money, a loss of freedom, and a loss of status, and a loss of network support. You can see in this photo just like how the city looks like a few years ago, of like a reopened shop in between the ruins of the building. So the drawing for me and the story that the drawing says, it's really for me a history that it's often untold. It's silenced, incomplete, and forgotten during the time of war, because like we always hear about giant wars, but we don't hear the impact of the war on the space of the everyday and the people. It is a history of women and men and children whose lives are ruptured by violence that manifests itself in the everyday life. Next slide, please. The history of Syria and the history of suffering is fading away. Someone recently has told me that our pain has turned from a headline in the news to a footnote in history. Which sadly, even now what we see in the war in Ukraine, people say we have a war fatigue, we want to live, we want to move on, and it's the story, even though it's so recent in our time, it starts to fade away, and before that, Afghanistan and many places. So how can the pain of people turn from the headlines into the footnote in history? I want to finish this really short presentation by reading a quote from an author who writes from inside Homs. In her writings, the author Muna Rafi', who writes with a different name, offers scenes of an everyday life between ruins and destruction, a life that continues somehow at the time of war. With words, she paints a picture of the fears, anxieties, and dreams of the people inside Homs, and describe their faces as she walks in the streets, imagining the worries and the thoughts that occupy their mind. How do these people, she asks, navigate the world in their everyday life? How do they dare to imagine a future as if she is holding our hands in her writings? She takes us so gently to show how life, despite all, continues. People still choose their clothes so they look fashionable. They still gather to celebrate a wedding. They still mourn and grieve. If they have some bread, they would share it with their neighbors. The generosity continues amidst the darkness and the despair of the war. The humanity remains and shines even at the time of the conflict. They are not erased, and they are not a footnote in history, these people who remain in a war zone. Next slide. Because as Muna Rafa says, despite our trauma and despite the rewriting of history, we are still here. This article she wrote to mark the 10th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution last year in 2021. And I just love the title, We Are Still Here, especially after I said like how we are fading away from history almost. So she says here, we are still here in Homs. Strength still exists inside us. We walk and sleep, we eat and fear, and we dream. The important thing is that we still dream. And the only thing that we are so sure of is that no one can eradicate or remove what is in our chests, no matter how it seems otherwise. And I just love to put this quote today, also like by reading the everyday life in Homs, as also drawing the everyday life by Diana. This event is titled, if you can maybe stop sharing the screens, please. This event is titled Drawing Syria from Afar, an event in honor of Syria. But I also want to thank everyone who helped putting this event together. But my biggest thanks is to the wonderful artist and dear friend, Diana Betherbridge, who spent months drawing Homs and Palmyra. As someone from Syria, I have found this work as a great homage to my own country. I found it profound that it makes me and makes many people in London slow down to think and reflect about what happened in Homs and what happens at the time of war. I hope that one day this drawing can also be exhibited, not in London, but in Homs, in a free Homs, in a city rebuilt on justice. I hope one day you and I, Diana, can go together to Syria, to Homs, when it's free, so we can have, so as you opened your home to me, I can also open my home to you. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Diana. Words are not enough really to thank you. I will end up here.
Fantastic, Ammar. Thank you so much. Catherine, can you just hit at the very top where there's the black arrow? You should be able to stop sharing the screen entirely.
I shall do my best. My Zoom is not showing everything, but I will work it out.
You did it. Someone did it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, whoever did that. And thank you very much, Ammar.
And I'm sorry to end such a beautiful talk with such a mundane request, but thank you, Ammar, very, very much. Really wonderful presentation for us. So we'll carry on with our second speaker, and that is Frances Carey. Many of us have known Frances as the head of international programs and deputy keeper of prints and drawings at the British Museum. More recently, a freelance curator and academic, and also the excellent chair of the Marie-Louise von Lotositsky Charitable Trust. Many other things as well. But Frances wrote a wonderful essay in a recent catalog for Diana's work, and we're delighted to have her here. So Frances, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you in particular to Ammar, because that was a very, very moving, inspiring introduction. And again, Diana is the reason we're all together. And Ammar brought out, I mean, despite the horror of what she's expressing, the poetry, too, of her work. And I want to talk briefly about the whole concept of traumascape, but I should begin by just, it seems presumptuous to quote Diana herself when she's here in person, but just to refer to some of the remarks many very, very cogent remarks she's made about her own practice. And first of all, starting by her view that her drawings are about the impossibility of drawing landscape. And of course, what she's doing is not attempting topographical exactitude or anything like that at all. She's creating a psychogeography, of course. And architecture is the way she does it. Architecture as metaphor, as a rationalization, as she's put it, of the society. It serves a material manifestation of the social, religious, and political structures and their interactions. It provides me with a structural paradigm for observing alien cultures and a common language for interpreting the unfamiliar. And with the two works that Ammar has illustrated already, of course, the destruction of Homs and that of Palmyra. Diana has not been there. I mean, there are places she has been to through reportage, through what she's read, through her imagination, and yet she has created something which, to my eyes, is more powerful than the many of the actual reportage, and I think will live on for far longer. But to go back to the concept of traumascapes, and that I take from the title of a book published in 2005 by Maria Tumarkin, and to quote from her, her full title is "The Power and Fate of Places Transformed by Tragedy, a distinctive category of places that have become a scar tissue that stretches around the world." And that's rather a terrible image. But my goodness, aren't we ever more aware of it day by day? Ukraine is at the forefront. But, everywhere we look, we see, further examples of that scar tissue. Unless we become complacent, there's plenty of it in this country too. And Diana's trademark architectonic compositions are immensely important in establishing the power and both the political and the psychic significance of all of this. And she says, most recently, now 50 years later, I am proposing that the architectonics of my recent political landscapes that do not relate to real topographies, but construct imaginary environments as metaphors of the domain of politics, gain a certain resonance through underlying abstraction, geometry, and measured proportions. Her vision is a dystopian and heterotopian one, to borrow from Michel Foucault's formulation: compositions full of recognizable elements, yet without function, reversed ruins in a way, built environments that do not fall into ruin after they are built, but rather rise into ruin before they are built. And that is one of the most terrifying aspects of her work. It's very destabilizing indeed. And this brings me to Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities of 1972, and his imagined narrative between Marco Polo and Kubla Khan, featuring 55 cities divided into 11 thematic groups that evoke different moods and psychogeographies. And one of these is Armilla, one of the thin cities made of water pipes. And there are a lot of things that look like water pipes among our aspects of Diana's work. It has no walls, no ceilings, no floors. It has nothing that makes it seem a city, except the water pipes that rise vertically where the houses should be and spread out horizontally where the floors should be. You would think that the plumbers had finished their job and gone away before the bricklayers arrived, or else their hydraulic systems, indestructible, had survived a catastrophe, an earthquake, or the corrosion of termites. And then in one of the cities of the sky, Marco Polo has this to say: those who arrive at Thekla can see little of the city beyond the plank fences, the sackcloth screens, the scaffoldings, the metal armatures, the wooden catwalks hanging from ropes or supported by sawhorses, the ladders, the trestles. If you ask why is Thekla's construction taking such a long time, the inhabitants continue hoisting sacks, lowering leaded strings, moving long brushes up and down as they answer, so that its destruction cannot begin. And if asked whether they fear that once the scaffoldings are removed, the city may begin to crumble and fall to pieces, they add hastily in a whisper, not only the city. And some of this richness is reference is present in all these recent works, more so even than in some of her earlier works, and I've admired her work for a very long time, particularly the series she did of Indian temples, which was based on direct experience. But so I want to ponder the whole idea of traumascapes and the sense, of Well, it's absence, because often, although actual spaces appear to be depicted, it's the absences that matter most. And that's something that a writer, a wonderful novelist living in exile from Sarajevo for some time in this country, Alexander Hemon, has talked about in one of his novels, and how, seeing pictures of destruction of Sarajevo, it wasn't the damage done to the buildings, it was just the absences. And we all experience that, not necessarily in such traumatic terms, but when things are taken away, it's very hard to actually remember what was there before. And I was struck by this just last night. I was on the Tottenham Court Road getting off the bus, and yet another building has been taken down. It was there, a short while ago, and it's completely gone. And I can't remember. I cannot imagine what was there before. And so there are all these sort of terrifying undercurrents to Deanna's work and our responses to them. And I want to thank her again for evoking this, making us, think so deeply about these issues. I can't think of another artist who does in the same way, and who has really captured some of the most salient aspects of the destruction that's going on around us, in real life on our television screens and so on. But again, thank you, Deanna. Thank you, Ammar.
Thank you, Frances. Another really great perspective on how Deanna's drawn landscapes provide so much impact and anchor so much thought, even for those of us, unlike Ammar, haven't seen it before. So let's move on. Next, we have Zena Kamash. I'm very happy to have her here. She's a British Iraqi archaeologist who specializes in the heritage of the Middle East, currently writing a book on heritage and healing in Syria and Iraq, and is leading a British Academy-funded project on Iraq called Crafting Heritage for Wellbeing in Iraq. So Zena, amazing. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Bill, for the introduction. And thank you, Catherine, for organising today. I'm just going to share my screen. Do that. So as others have said, my thanks also to Deanna, and in particular, I feel privileged to have visited Deanna in her studio to see this particular work, which you can see, I hope, in front of you on the screen. What I'm going to do today is read, which is uncharacteristic of me. I normally speak off the cuff, but I'm going to read today a short extract from my book on heritage and healing, where I reflect on Deanna's drawing. And I hope that in doing so, it will also bring out some wider themes that maybe we can pick up in the discussion. So I'll start reading the extract now. I find this drawing challenging to look at, which I do not mean negatively, rather that my eye is constantly roving and unsettled. I flit between reference points, never quite grasping them, which feels quite fitting for a subject of such scope and complexity. Easiness would be inappropriate here. Time feels jumbled with flashes of clarity, for example, in the intricate detail of a column capital. There are also ghostly, shadowy elements that never quite resolve. In this, I find parallels with the paradoxes of traumatic memory, flashbacks that are painful in their too strong clarity against a murky backdrop of confusion and amnesia. Some parts I find easier than others. While the areas of rubble point to destruction, I do not find these as disturbing as the vertical voids in the left panel or the aqueduct to the right. Structure here. I spent some time dwelling on why this might be. My conclusion, for now at least, is that as an archaeologist, rubble is my bread and butter. I deal constantly with remnants and am equipped to work through fragmented pieces of the past. The messiness of fragments does not scare me. Instead, I see within it stories to be revealed. I can find people in those rubble stories where there are nooks and crannies for the unexpected, the narratives that go against the grain. In the river of rubble in the middle panel, which Diana explicitly states as being entirely fictional, I find the metaphor to be very much in keeping with Tadmor Palmyra and its history. Water lies at the heart of Tadmor Palmyra. Without the Efka spring and its oasis, a settlement here would be near impossible. But does this river of rubble speak of life or of death? My first instinct was death, a river that is blocked and choked by destruction. The more I looked and reflected, however, the more I began to see potential for life in this river of rubble. Its sinuous, flowing movement through the drawing resists the strict geometry of the architecture. It hints at a different path to take, an alternative future. I feel quite differently about the vertical voids and the aqueduct. I also feel that they are distinctly different to each other. The vertical voids feel more redolent of the brutality of the recent destruction at Tadmor Palmyra than the piles and river of rubble. The erasures are disturbingly crisp and bright, yet I struggle to reach for what is present in their stark emptiness. While the rubble speaks to me of stories waiting to be told, I am unable to find any people in these blanks. The only hope I find here is that as they reach up through the drawing, their power diminishes until they gradually recede, potentially leaving ghostly spaces where rubble stories might be told. The aqueduct in the right and centre panels, however, feels more substantial, like something that will be difficult to move. The aqueduct is negatively disruptive. It gets in the way of the structures behind, blocking the view. It cuts straight across the site's history bluntly and without finesse. The pillars supporting the superstructure make a direct visual reference to the ghostly reminiscences of pillars echoing underneath the skynephrons of the theatre. In their lack of imagination, the aqueduct's pillars stifle creativity, a mockery of the past. Lying beneath these mocking pillars is what Diana calls an invented chasm. This violent tearing through the site's history brings me feelings of unease. On the one hand, the archaeologist in me is tempted to peer down as though at an archaeological trench. But this peering also feels like a voyeuristic act that continues this invasion of space. In this, I am reminded of my revulsion towards the Daesh tunnels in Nineveh, in Mosul, in Iraq, where I feel strongly that these should not be sanitized into an archaeological opportunity. The concrete-like cables spanning the chasm also disturb me. They seem to be needed to stabilize the ground for the aqueduct above. Their presence, and by extension that of the aqueduct, seem to keep this tearing wound open, preventing healing from taking place. This drawn metaphor of reconstruction efforts then captures my many misgivings about the reconstruction process. Thank you.
Fantastic, Zena. Thank you very much, both for putting some really important themes on the table, but also for actually giving us a proper close reading of the image that has brought us all together. Very happy to have had that. Thank you. And then finally, our last speaker is Jen Baird, Professor of Archaeology in the Department of History, Classics, and Archaeology at Birkbeck, very nearby. Her work focuses on archaeological archives in particular, both as sources for previously ignored data or phenomena, and also as subjects in themselves, essential for our knowledge of the formation of archaeological knowledge. Among her recent publications are the book Dura Europos from Bloomsbury, and also the special issue of the Bulletin of the Institute of Classical Studies that Catherine referred to, entitled Remembering Roman Syria, which was co-edited, in fact, with Zena, our previous speaker. So closing the loop, the circle, Jen, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you all this evening, even if it's not in person as we planned, and to follow my brilliant colleagues in reflecting on Diana Petherbridge's work. I'd like to echo everyone's thanks to Catherine and the ICS for organizing things, and mostly to Deanna for creating this. So I'm an archaeologist of the Roman period in Syria. I worked there for many years before the war. And you think that being an archaeologist would mean that ruins are a comfortable place for me. I think Zena said something along the same lines. But the ruination of Syria over the past decade has been something that it's almost impossible to know how to respond to. And one of the things I really love about this work is precisely the way it finds a response in that discomfort. One of the reasons it's difficult as an archaeologist is because among so many archaeologists, Syria has become a story about them, about ourselves, about archaeological loss, about fieldwork we can't do or travel we can't do anymore, sites we can't go to. And sadly, what most are not attending to is the living heritage of Syria's people, the losses that Ammar is talking about earlier. And at Palmyra itself, there's a terrible history of placing the needs of archaeology above those of people. Infamously, there was the forced removal of local people and their houses from the temenos, within the temenos of the Temple of Bel in the 1920s. And that story of kind of archaeological displacement starts much earlier in Palmyra, already with the very first published images of the site in Robert Wood's 1753 book, the book that Catherine started us speaking about tonight. The local houses of people and the people themselves of Palmyra appeared as miniatures. They're barely visible among the classical ruins. They're deliberately downscaled. Wood's first notebooks and the first drawings of Palmyra made by his draftsman Bora are held in the joint library. And if we were together in person tonight, I'd be showing you the small exhibit that's in the lobby, but you're welcome to come anytime. It's right outside the library. And we've put out for display some of those original records alongside the published versions. Those 18th century engravings published in wood have cast long shadows on how Palmyra is understood and represented. But for me, Patherbridge's River of Rubble is in many ways a more meaningful view of the site. It's a more poignant reminder of what's been lost and what remains still. Alongside the drawings and engravings in the exhibit, we've placed objects made by contemporary Syrian artisans. So there's some mosaics, embroideries, and these depict some of the same views that Bora recorded that are published in wood from a different perspective. These come to us from a Syrian organization called Heritage for Peace, whose initiative Palmyrene Voices has a mission to provide a platform of voices for Palmyrene people to reach the international community and to support their livelihoods. So I'll pop a link in the chat so you can have a look, give them some support if you want. So that's all I wanted to say for tonight, but thanks again to everyone, and I'll hand back to our chair.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you for your role in creating this fantastic display that I actually walk through as I come into my temporary office. I too was displaced by the building project, which means I'm not in the Warburg Institute. I'm in Senate House at the moment. But I'm really impressed by this exhibition and think everybody should come and see it, as well as the piece by Deanna. So those of you who have not spoken, feel free to pose questions or comments in the chat. We'll be monitoring that and giving you the chance to pose your questions. But while you gather your thoughts, I'd like to maybe just have a small conversation among the speakers on the panel. And there are a number of threads that we might want to pick up on, but I think maybe the first thing we should do is just ask directly, what does the work of an artist, of a living artist, engaging with artistic method in the way that Deanna does, artistic practice in the way that Deanna does, bring to a place like the Institute of Classical Studies, or for that matter, the Warburg Institute, which is primarily devoted to book-based research on antiquity and its afterlife. So in terms of how Diana helps us to remember, to frame the questions that archaeologists and historians and architects work on. All of you have touched on this, but I wonder if anyone wants to say any more about the way an artist brings new perspectives and new materials. And do feel free, any of you, to just jump in.
Can I just maybe to break the ice? I think for me, especially since like 2011, many people say that Syria is maybe in history one of the most documented wars, because of course of social media, because of people are turning into citizen journalists by themselves. So even though journalists were not permitted to be inside the country very often, but people were filming and documenting. So what we ended up with, like the entire world is watching and nothing is happening. And we also end up like in a place where we are flooding in information and misinformation.
Yeah.
And you feel like it's becoming part of the normalization of war. It's becoming like every day there's more war or more war in our eyes, and nobody is doing anything. So for me, what I find incredible in the work of any artist, including the work of Diana, of course, is that it almost takes all these like masses and masses of information and try to digest it, try to make sense of the trauma, try to make sense of that flood of information by slowing us down, by bringing us closer to what it means to lose one's home. So for me, it's the work of the art. It could be a piece of literature, it could be a drawing, a painting, a piece of music. It's really to slow down and to tell us like what has happened in a time where we are flooding with information. So for me, this is maybe one of the points that I find as the power of the art in time of conflict and war.
That's really well put. Thank you so much. Again, not allowing it to be normalized, that all of this documentation and reportage can lead to. I mean, it's extraordinary in a way how quickly that seems to be happening in the case of the Ukrainian conflict. So yeah, very well put. Anyone, Zena, Jen, Francis, you want to add anything to that?
I think I'd add in terms of the library setting at the moment, it's an opportune reminder to our students and to everyone using that library that these are not questions of the past. These have direct and painful direct and painful presence. These are things we need to think through very carefully in how we frame thinking about the past and what it means. And more broadly, kind of outside the library, outside the Warburg, for me, that this Diana's work and the work of other artists like Michael Rakowitz and Marisha Naliyari all serve to disrupt the kind of accepted norms, particularly around post-conflict reconstruction, and those projects which tend to be very anodyne and lacking in people and lacking in care, whereas these reflections really center people. And even though Diana's work is striking in the lack of people featuring, like I try to bring out, we can still find them in there. They still lie at the heart of the work, and that's what's so important, that these aren't dry, dusty ruins with no people.
And in fact, because of that unsettled nature of the perspective in many of these large-scale drawings of Diana, they're extremely engaging of our own bodies and our own presence. And again, that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to visit the piece in person and see how that actually works in space. But actually, another thing you remind me now, Zena, when you're talking, is, in some ways, a lot of the evidence that we use as historians or as archaeologists are about fixing something in its time. That's contextualization. That's very much the name of the game. It's what we work hard to learn how to do. in many ways, what motivates Diana and, in my case, A.B. Warburg, the founder and creator of my institute, is the desire. Oh, sorry, hold on. I'm in a room that has sensors for lights that, if I don't move, they go off. Warburg, like Diana, I think, are very much about the way in which time is jumbled, I think is the way you put it, Zena, that there's always past in present and present in past. And the multiplicity of time is actually quite difficult for us to engage with in a scholarly way. And I think the way in which Diana has pictured these shifting frames, past and future, are absolutely intermingled in a single frame. And I think that's really powerful. So for me, it's one of the things that I found most immediately alive about this work and immediately relevant for a reading room at the Warburg Institute. Yeah, Frances.
Well, her work, all of her work, has tremendous grandeur, and I defy anybody, to ignore it. And certainly they won't ignore the destruction of Palmyra in whichever reading room it's in, and it will become an archetypal image, and it will make people think, long after the immediate circumstances in Syria. It's a historical piece, of course, already. Everything becomes so very quickly. But you said the unsettling perspective, everything that happens visually, but which is also going on psychologically. It's a really remarkable achievement, and it's wonderful that it's being shared with both the ICS and the Warburg.
Yeah, and I'm very taken with Ammar's idea about showing it back in Homs. Particularly, we'll have to talk to the Tate about whether they'll lend their work, but the two works, of course, are very closely related, and it would be something to really hope for and make happen together. So thank you very much for making that suggestion. Catherine.
I'm not really supposed to be on this discussion panel, but since you asked your question, what difference does it make to the ICS? I thought perhaps I should chip in. I'm very struck by the way that, Ammar, you focused on the everyday and the everydayness, and that there was something in Diana's work which you felt attended to that. And the contrast, Jen spoke about this very briefly, but the contrast of that with the history of archaeological illustration, and the history of much of the coverage of the damage to Tadmor Palmyra in 2015 and onwards. An example of many cases in which greater concern appears to be manifest for antiquities than for living people. Not that antiquities are not important and don't have a great deal of continuing value. And I suppose I thought of Zena's discussion of how she is accustomed or accultured to seeing rubble as, in a way, a source. I'm a literary scholar, so I might talk about sources, but I think there are various modes of discipline that go on when people are becoming researchers who investigate the past, which direct us to attend to things in particular ways and not in others. And I think that goes on in many subjects. I think it goes on in philosophy as well, the subject of my own doctoral research. We can talk about the philosophy of very painful things in a very detached way. And I think there is something that creative artists and practitioners of various kinds can do in our academic spaces to help us connect to our material in a different way.
It's brilliant. Thank you so much. Do any of you want to ask any of the other panelists anything? Anything you want to jump in on? I mean, Zena, I guess, and Jen, one question I would have for you that, sorry, I saw, Ammar, you were just about to speak. I didn't mean to cut you off, but just quickly, I mean, I'm also very struck by the prompt to think about how we archive. It's something that as directors of institutions, we're lucky enough to be able to help shape. But also as scholars, we all use these archives, and I guess one kind of question is how should Deanna's work just become part of the building, part of the fabric, or should it become part of the archive? And I think that's a really interesting, challenging question in a way, and I guess it's in my case, and Catherine, for another year plus for you, asking us also, I suppose, about how we give home to these works in our spaces, and how do we make them speak and keep speaking? Is it simply a matter of wanting people who are in your library, say, reading the Robert Wood papers, to have this in their site? Or do we actually want to activate the archive in a different way? Or Jen, maybe you want to speak about the exhibition, the way the small cases of the exhibition are creating a kind of archival vestibule as we make our way into the library.
Yeah, I mean, as an archaeologist, I would say having the work in the build, like that is archival. Like it is, the building is an archive, a living archive in which it's active. I mean, one of the things that's really striking, and it's one of the things that's a shame about not being there, is the scale of the work compared to the scale of Wood. But then also something that Zena and I write a bit about is then the scale of the original drawings from the archive. The pencil drawings on which these kind of very monumental engravings that become very famous are based. They're really ephemeral little things, and even they've digitized them now, they're online, which is brilliant, through the SAS archive online, but you lose that kind of sense of scale and encounter from archives. So that's not really answering your question, but I think there is something about that archival encounter for these materials that is really important as we think about them.
It's a very important point. I think you're right, particularly about media and working between physical and digital. It isn't something that we can do particularly well at the moment, or that is done particularly well. And it's true, I was just joking for those of you who have joined us that Catherine's backdrop, because her head takes up about the space of one panel as we see it there, that's very misleading because each panel is slightly larger than a normal person in their entirety. It's a huge work, and I still don't quite understand how Deanna has physically made it. The amount of labor involved in a canvas or a paper that is larger than her, it's an extraordinary feature of the work that you must see in person, as I said. Anyway, Ammar, did you want to come back in and ask what you were going to ask?
Thank you. Maybe it was just a question actually on like how we see Palmyra as a site of cultural heritage, how it has been used and abused throughout the last decade by different partners. And I wanted maybe to ask my fellow panelists if they have reflection, especially when we saw, for instance, Russia and Putin doing the concert on the site of Palmyra, and with almost an absence of any introduction by somebody from the local community, from Tadmor, and he would be joining from a screen on the theater. And the way that it has been reported in many countries, like, look how Putin is like using music to bring peace to the country. and like almost whitewashing the pain of the people, whitewashing all the killing and the destruction conducted by Russia and the Syrian government. So I wanted to ask if my fellow panelists have any reflection on the abuse of the cultural heritage sites and how it has been introduced maybe throughout your teaching to the students. And yeah, thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to come in on that one. I mean, I think Jen rightly pointed out that this has been a very long process of taking apart, of divorcing what is now an archaeological site from the people who live there, that was started in the writings of Robert Wood, made manifest by Honoré Zeyrig in the French Mandate, and their physical moving of the village outside of the archaeological site. And then, of course, what's happened more recently, and I mean, one of the things I find most abusive, and one of the reasons I'm writing the book I'm writing, is how offensive I find so many of the reconstruction projects, and the way that they capitalize on people's trauma and pain for essentially their own gain in various different ways, including the Russian state and their project that they have as well, that goes under numerous names. And of course, what doesn't get reported on in the press, in the creating of the narrative around the destruction at Tadmor Palmyra, is who was doing what at different times. In the Western media, this is very much painted as destruction by Daesh. And while that is true, they were not the only actors involved in destroying Tadmor Palmyra. The Syrian government forces and the Russian forces also wreaked a lot of destruction, and not just of the archaeological site. What also doesn't get reported on is how much of the modern town, cemeteries, hospitals, places holding food storage, were also destroyed, and those stories are being lost in a story that in the Western media focuses so heavily on the cultural heritage. I slightly rambled away from the point I think I was trying to make at the beginning, but I suppose just what I'm trying to say is that I find it all deeply troubling, and what I find powerful in the work of artists, particularly artists who have a very strong activist stance, is a moment to pause and say, actually, what is happening here? What are the other stories that we can tell that might rebalance the predominant narratives?
Thank you, Zena. Yeah, indeed. I don't know if Jen or Francis want to come in on this question.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the teaching side of Ammar's question, because it's something that so I'm teaching a course now. I'm on Palmyra and Dura Europos and the destructions, and I haven't got a perfect answer to it, but part of it is about just making it a much longer story. So it's not a story about the Roman past, and it's not a story about 21st century destructions, but it's a really like, how have we come to know these places? Why do we have the relationships with them that we do? And whose voices should we be listening to when we do that? So my Syrian colleague Adnan Mohammed is here. I'm sorry, Adnan, for calling you out by name, but he's going to be teaching and contributing to that course. And, it's just about also for the students, like asking questions. So it's really interesting teaching in Bloomsbury and, going to the museum, the British Museum next door, and saying, why are these Palmyrene portraits here? Why these are funerary portraits, that closed tombs that were meant to protect the people inside for eternity. Why have they been in London for 150 years, 200? What are these things doing here? So yeah, asking difficult questions mostly with my students and perplexing them. But yeah, that's a partial answer.
Thank you.
Sorry if Francis was trying to come in too.
Francis, you? No? No. Okay. Francis, did you want to?
No, not at all. Thank you.
Yes, I didn't want to put you on the spot to speak for your former institution, but I am curious now that we've mentioned several projects. I don't know, Zena, if this is one that you had in mind, but of course, a lot of us remember the. I want to ask a little bit about the famous Trafalgar Square display, and whether there is any role for not reconstruction necessarily, but reproduction, copying. I mean, it's interesting because Deanna's work is so much not a copy, but it has some similarities to traditional archaeological modes of capturing a foreign or alien landscape. And now we have, of course, digital technology that makes possible forms of reproduction or forms of transfer of physical artifacts from one place to another that are not the original object or the authentic object. Do any of you feel there is a place for that, or was that misguided? Or, I mean, is it worth just dwelling briefly on that quite controversial project, leaving Boris Johnson's role or presence in the whole episode aside? That's just a bit of a red herring at the moment, or maybe not. Any thoughts about that and how it might relate to what we're talking about?
I have a lot of thoughts about that, which I have expressed many times. And really, one of the starting points of the book was that arch. So for people who may not know what Bill is referring to here, the Institute for Digital Archaeology, which is a fairly shady organisation, put up a 2/3 scale replica of part of an archway in Tadmor, Palmyra in 2016, I think it was now.
I think so.
I mean, even if we just think about scale in comparison, so this was set up in Trafalgar Square, where it looked disappointingly small in comparison to the very large and imposing architectural landscape around it, and also the placing of it within that particular architectural landscape also raises numerous uncomfortable juxtapositions around the kind of imperial victory monuments that were never really dealt with. In comparison, then we have Deanna's large-scale drawing, which is completely the opposite. It can only be imposing in its scale. And another comparison, 18 months later, Michael Rakowitz's Lamassu was put on the fourth plinth. That was life-size. Coincidentally, the base of the Lamassu was exactly the same size as the fourth plinth. And it did everything in that space that the replica arch was unable to do. It was imposing, it shone, and it played with form, it played with materials in a way that the arch it had no heart. It was supposed to all be about accuracy, and although the actual rendering of it was far from accurate, but that kind of emphasis on accuracy is something that comes out in wood as well, and that kind of control over other people's heritage, because you can measure it, you can create it, you have the technologies to do things that supposedly people can't do for themselves. So while I think there can be a role for technology, for reconstruction, I don't think that is the role for it. I think it needs to be part of a conversation with local communities. It needs to reflect their needs and wishes, and it needs to be for them, not for grandstanding in Trafalgar Square. I could carry on. I won't.
Yeah, just the audacity to think that they could make some flimsy copy and just say, oh, look, don't worry. It doesn't matter that it's gone. It doesn't matter what happened. We can fix it with some 3D printing. And when it wasn't actually 3D printed, but they claimed it was. But anyway, yeah. Just to gloss Zena's outrage.
But it is interesting to think about the way Deanna's work, which is not an accurate reproduction or a copy in any way, has a kind of attentiveness that really carries all of what those attempts at accurate reproduction apparently aim for. So that's a really strange phenomenon, a very interesting phenomenon, how in a way a drawing of something at secondhand or from afar can be more accurate maybe than something. Yes, thanks for the reference in the chat to Zena's article. For those of you who want more on that. But yes, I think Deanna's work can be weirdly more accurate in a funny way than a photograph or than an eyewitness account or a digital copy. So again, very interesting. Anyone in the audience not in the panel want to put anything in the chat before we wrap up? Anything else that anyone wants to ask or share from our panelists?
Could I ask one question?
Yeah, please,
that you touched on when we were touching on the issue of students and people who are not grand digital reconstructionists or disciplined archaeologists. I just wonder about the kinds of engagements that people formulate in response to, say, the teaching that you're doing, Jen. I mean, you mentioned putting difficult questions to your students, but I wondered what kinds of questions your students put to you, and likewise, Ammar. I mean, you're now lecturing. I wondered, how you approach these encounters, and Zena, obviously, in some of your engagement projects as well as your teaching, you have been working with people who are may have a different perspective, and I wondered what we can learn from those responses as well.
I think from my side, what I find very important when talking to students about heritage and reconstruction, destruction of heritage, is really to talk about the politics of reconstruction and the politics of heritage. Because any example we might see about reconstruction, we need to ask the big questions on why are we reconstructing that? We have to ask the essential questions of for whom and by whom. Like we are all talking about this monument in like in Trafalgar Square. I read a lot about it. Like the person who was like navigating all that, he was saying like, I sat in Trafalgar Square looking at Syrians in traditional clothes. I didn't know what traditional clothes. So it was almost like an Orientalist also approach. Like we have to be labeled in a certain way. So for me, yes, with the students, I'm interested in showing them what are the tools that we can use today in terms of like technologies and processes and the power of like the digital, but also like thinking about the fundamental questions on the politics of heritage. Who has the right to write history? Who has the right to rewrite it? Who is doing what and why and for whom? And I think students at this age, like I almost feel like there's an appetite to unpack these questions, but it's just like showing them what's the direction, and trying to ask relevant and timely questions about heritage. And I think my students always have like hunger to ask and to respond when I unpack these questions. So it's fascinating, but definitely it's a mission for us as academics and researchers and artists to try not to escape from the difficult questions, but to face them and try to work with them, with the students.
Yeah, everything Ammar just said. And I think both in my teaching and in my engagement projects, what is striking is how easily actually people can move beyond the very simplistic narratives that they're fed. Once you give them a prompt, once you give them even just a few tools to start scratching the surface, start thinking in more sophisticated ways. So, you know, often people's knee-jerk response to destruction is, oh, well, we must reconstruct it. But if you actually then, why, for whom, all the questions Ammar just put there, that thinking shifts and changes and becomes more sophisticated. And also when you put people in a room together, some of the most striking things that happened in one project I ran around Iraqi heritage and crafting a pilot project for the project actually happening in Iraq. We had people of Iraqi heritage now living in Britain in a mixed groups with British people who were there for all sorts of reasons. Some people were there because they were learning Arabic, some people just like crafting. Those conversations, that opening up of understanding was really striking. And one set of feedback, which I think is really hopeful and touches again on something Ammar said earlier about people getting sort of not overwhelmed, but immune to what they see on the news. They said, you know, that being in that room, engaging in the way that they did, made them be able to go beyond that immunity and actually went away and started reading about Iraq and understanding about it in more depth. So I think, you know, we can open up those conversations, and we can use creative and artistic practice as that route in, and it can be very powerful.
Excellent. Thank you both. I mean, I have to say, Catherine, I think in moving towards closing the event, I mean, I think our goal for this event was partly just to celebrate Diana and thank her for the work, for doing this extraordinary piece, but also I think hoping that it would start the process of activating the work in new homes. And I think that's definitely been achieved tonight. And I like the idea very much of it basically being between Deanna's studio, your reading room, and our future reading room. That seems like the right set of places for it at the moment, but also very much with Ammar, the home that Ammar saw in the work on Homs. I thought that was an extremely important and moving place to start. And as I said, Ammar, hopefully to return as well at the end of the process. And I also very much hope we can keep the work in circulation with Diana's permission, of course, and in ways that are safe and suitable. I want to keep it in motion. So let's all thank Diana again, I think, for that. Yeah, Diana, do you want to just jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to say I have written so much about my work. I've thought so much about all these issues that we've discussed tonight. I've discussed them with Ammar so many times. And I have muted myself tonight because I've always felt there's a moment when you can write so much about what you are doing. I need to hear what other people think about the work. I can't determine it. It's a kind of power play for an artist to write about their own work. So my muting tonight has been a sort of act of homage to all of you and to your opinions. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for allowing it to be there. Thank you, Bill. Thank you all for attending.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. And Catherine, would you like to open the close? Sure.
Yes. First, thank you very much, Diana. It's absolutely wonderful to have your work in the library. So absolute privilege. Thank you. And I'd like to say thank you to Bill for allowing us to hang Diana's picture. Oh, he's gone again. He did say when he came to see it hanging, "You are going to let me have it back, aren't you?" Well, of course. But I of course want to thank our speakers, Ammar and Francis and Zena and Jen. But there are a couple of people behind the scenes also who we need to thank. We need to thank Asma and Dana, who have provided the simultaneous interpretation tonight. We also need to thank our professional colleagues in the ICS and in the Warburg. That's Valerie and George and John, who have been making everything work and handling the registration, the frequent changes in plan, the shift from in-person to online to in-person. I've lost it. And I also would like to thank two librarians. I'd like to thank Karen Attar from Senate House Library, who's also the curator of art for the university, who was very involved in the hanging of the picture and the exhibition as well. Jen, who brought the exhibition back and redisplayed it and brought us the works from the Palmyrene Voices initiative. And of course, Palmyrene Voices, we should also thank. I also wanted to just say, please, anyone who is on this call and would like to come to the Institute of Classical Studies to visit the exhibit and to visit Diana's drawing, please do feel free to do so. I have Joanna Ash on the call, who is the classics librarian. She says that anyone is very welcome to come and visit. There's Joanna. Would you like to say, Joanna, what the arrangements are as you've made yourself visible?
I can do, yes. Everybody's very welcome to come and visit the library, see the work in situ. We've got a system, basically. Just come to the library desk on the third floor in Senate House, say you want to see the work, we'll give you a visitor sticker and let you in to come and see it. And at the same time, come and see the lovely exhibition we've got. The exhibition will be there until the end of the autumn term, so about another 5 or 6 weeks. So if you come before mid-December, you can see both. But of course, if you can't make it before then, come any other time later, as long as we've got the work in the library, and come and see it where it sits, where it looks absolutely perfect. And I will be devastated when we have to let it go.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you for your role as well in this event and in getting it hung and in allowing us to use the library space as well. I think that is it for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope this has been as interesting and as worthwhile an event as it has been, certainly for me, and hope to see you all soon or at some point in the Institute Library. Thank you.